The night sky and the lure of space have always pulled on the human imagination. But exploration did not really take place until the mid-1900s. But then it happened fast.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Early space exploration was both competitive and collaborative, but the media really focused on the competition that was these heightened political tensions and an extension of the Cold War.
Reaction was one of astonishment and concern.
On Sputnik 1, the Soviet space satellite.
Research in space improved life on Earth from the very beginning, and today, the International Space Station is a symbol of global collaboration.
The amount of money spent on the space program is worth every penny. I think there are things we get from the space program that are valuable to our life on Earth.
I'm Cray Novick.
And I'm Myrna James. It's time to go behind the wings.
In this episode, we're going to explore the question, how did human spaceflight start, and how is it affecting us today? To start, we headed to NASA's Center for Human Flight, Johnson Space Center, to talk with NASA historian Jennifer Rothnazal. How did Johnson Space Center first get started?
In 1958, NASA was created.
This is my first opportunity to greet you as Deputy Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
It was created as a response to the launch of Sputnik.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
The first orbiting satellite around the globe. And Congress was very interested in establishing an organization to put a human being into space. And there was a group established called the Space Task Group. It was established about a month after NASA came into being. Its purpose really was to put a man into space. It was a manned satellite program. It became known as Project Mercury.
Project Mercury is the name given to the nation's manned orbital spaceflight program.
They were based out of the Langley Research Center, but that group formed the nucleus of what would become the Manned Spacecraft Center here in Houston. Once Kennedy gave his speech in May of 1961 that we were going to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade and return him safely, they realized they needed an actual facility, an actual center just for human spaceflight. Before that time, human spaceflight was seen sort of as a passing fad, a fancy. The deputy director for NASA at that time likened it to shooting a lady out of a cannon. And so it was sort of fortuitous that Kennedy proclaimed that we were going to achieve this amazing goal by the end of the decade.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
And so they started looking around at other locations all across the country, and Houston was one of those locations. So it was built essentially to get us to that final end date of landing a man on the moon by 1969. The individual who was in charge of the Space Task Group at the time heard that announcement and wondered, my God, how are we going to accomplish all of this? And he had to figure out how they were going to make all of this work in a very short time, in about 9 years. So that really was, a huge challenge. But NASA had been actually studying how are we going to get to the moon prior to this. It just, increased the pace. NASA was trying to figure that out well before President Kennedy made this announcement on the floor of Congress.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
It was definitely a proxy war for the Cold War. If you look at the Kennedy administration, they had the Cuban Missile Crisis. They also had, some other missteps early on in the administration, and this was an opportunity for him to take something and get a win. How could he beat the Soviet Union? And this was something that they realized we might be on more even ground with the Soviet Union, sending a man to the moon and returning him at the end of the decade.
Lands Giant Leap, Apollo 11 lands crew on moon. The first Wright brothers flight was in 1903, and then it was only 66 years later when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. in 1969.
A lot happened in those 66 years. The NACA, or the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, had been around since 1915, and people had already been thinking about human spaceflight.
These astronauts had to learn everything, every aspect of going to space, from rocket propulsion to orbital mechanics to what happens to the human body when they go to space, right?
So how did the first astronauts prepare to go to space, somewhere where no one had been before?
Astronauts train a lot, and so do folks in flight control. There's the saying that you train as you fly as you train. In those early Mercury flights, they did a lot of training because they weren't exactly sure what to expect. They put them through centrifuge rides up in Pennsylvania. They put them on the KC-135, which is a weightless aircraft. They did a lot of simulations of their missions, what they were going to be doing in orbit. Same thing with Gemini and Apollo. They were working through all of those missions and working through all of the requirements for their flight. They didn't just get into the capsule and go up in orbit and kind of see how things worked. There was a lot going on behind the scenes before anyone ever went up.
NASA has spent a lot of time throughout its history of going into remote environments and what they call analog environments. So to put astronauts or scientists in extreme environments all over the world. We know the ones, for example, like Antarctica is a classic. Back in the days of Gemini, Mercury, and Apollo, there was an interest in going into remote jungle areas. So the Air Force had a training program in tropical survival down in Panama. And so NASA contracted with the Air Force to bring the astronauts like Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins into that survival program. They went into the territory of a tribe down there called the Embera, which was and still is a remote jungle area.
And so they went down to Panama at the Albrook Air Force Base. And they were working with the Choco Indians, so they were natives of that area. This was a really great cross-cultural exchange for astronauts and also for the natives in Panama. The idea basically behind Tropic Survival School was, first of all, to learn how to survive if, God forbid, your capsule came down in a jungle environment. How would you handle that?
We're in Panama, where it all started. The first NASA astronauts to walk on the moon were trained here for wilderness survival by the indigenous people, just in case.
We've driven about an hour outside of Panama City, and we're about to get into a dugout canoe with a motor, and that's the only way to get to his village. We'll interview Chief Zarco there.
Ahí está bien.
Ahora vamos al museo.
Chief Zarco, tell me about your grandfather.
Estos son mi abuelo, la esposa y varias hijas de ellos. Dice también en verano que tocó la luna. Mi abuelo aquí muy joven, sí, muy joven. Y bueno, aquí tenemos otro que estaba entrenando. Nosotros acá le decimos balsa, cómo se amarra, cómo cortar. Entonces él le está enseñando. Lo que él enseñaba es a los 11,000 soldados y también a los astronautas.
People who were being trained to go to the moon and go into space acknowledged what they could learn from you and from your culture. Chief Zarco, what were some of the things that the astronauts learned here?
Cuando ellos subían a la luna, cuando ellos caían en la Tierra, ellos ya sabían lo que mi abuelo, lo que enseñaron cuando estuvieron en la Tierra, cómo sobrevivir, qué comer cuando ellos ya caminaban, cómo ellos podían tomar agua, fruta, qué fruta puede comer, qué fruta no puede comer. También tenemos como las plantas medicinales, entonces ya ellos sabían cómo hacer en qué parte están, porque nosotros también utilizamos lo que es el sol, en qué parte estamos, entonces así sobrevivir.
Why is this area such an ideal place to train astronauts?
Donde nosotros estamos, el bosque es cerrado, hay muchos árboles grandes. También mi abuelo nos explicaba, cuando fueron a Vietnam, en ese tiempo, la guerra, en Vietnam es parecido a este lugar. Por eso que los americanos llegaron a este lugar. Entonces toda esa experiencia que mi abuelo le dio, ya ellos sabían, pero también compartiendo con los astronautas. Siempre en nuestra cultura, nosotros cuando uno muere, un envenenado, decimos, bueno, el envenenado ya se fue a la luna. Por eso que también cuando hablaron de la luna, viene la persona, bueno, voy a enseñar. Nuestro abuelo decía, bueno, nosotros vamos a enseñar todo para que también ellos conozcan.
You know, they had a lot of cross-cultural interaction with the Choco Indians, worked very closely with the chief, Antonio Zarco, and you know, encouraged them to get to know the folks as part of their training so that they would feel comfortable. And when they came back, they did a debriefing and talked about, well, what did you learn? And you know, they learned that the jungle isn't as scary as they thought it was. The most important thing I think that they walked away with was the fact that it was important to have this optimistic point of view when you went on a mission, that you weren't going to die if you landed in the jungle or desert, because they did desert survival training. You know, it was important to do the training, but to have optimism that you were going to make it out okay.
Some of the astronauts who trained in Panama actually were the ones who walked on the moon.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The Earth, as it appears from the moon, is a very small and fragile object. And when you think about it, that's not an inaccurate description. Certainly a lot of the things that we do down here can affect the balance in a very fragile way. The greenhouse effect we're noticing today, for example, the changes between a healthy atmosphere and an unhealthy atmosphere are very subtle, very, very fragile, and you sort of get that feeling when you look at the Earth from a great distance.
Seeing the Earth from space can cause a significant psychological impact called the overview effect. To learn more, we spoke with cultural anthropologist Dr. Dina Weibel.
Dina, it's so great to speak with you today. What is the overview effect?
So the overview effect is a term that was actually coined by a journalist, Frank White, who is also a researcher. When people go into space for the first time and look from their spacecraft to the Earth, the awareness that it's actually a planet, suddenly the borders are not real anymore. You see that they're imaginary. You see that everything is interconnected. You see the Earth as much more fragile. And a lot of astronauts have had this experience where it was like a sudden realization, something that caused them to rethink what it meant to live on a planet, rethink things like environmental awareness. Some astronauts have become really, really strongly focused on getting information out about global climate change and other things we need to do to protect the planet.
Steve Lindsay, I'm so excited to speak with you today, and I almost don't know where to start. You've had such an illustrious, amazing career.
I applied and was fortunate enough to get selected in 1995 to the NASA astronaut office as a pilot astronaut. So I spent 16 years at NASA, and while I was there, I was fortunate enough or blessed to fly 5 space shuttle missions, 2 as pilot, 3 as a commander.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. My final flight was actually the final flight of Discovery. The trip in a space shuttle.
Go for main engine start.
Being on a launch pad to orbit is 8.5 minutes long.
We have main engine start.
Most 8.5 minutes of intensity you'll ever experience.
2, 1, and the final liftoff of Discovery, a tribute to the dedication, hard work, and pride of America's space shuttle team.
Discovery's 3 main engines are burning fuel at a rate that would drain an average swimming pool in about 25 seconds. The engines, combined with the solid rocket boosters, produce more than 7 million pounds of thrust. Standing by for separation of the twin solid rocket boosters, Discovery now traveling 2,695 miles an hour.
I'm picturing this extremely fast speed that you're going. And it makes me think of the overview effect. So what was that like? Did that happen for you?
I first saw the Earth on my first flight. We were, during ascent, we were probably 50, 60 miles high, doing about, I don't know, Mach 12 or so during ascent. So the rockets are firing, and we actually did this, what's called a roll to heads up, to shift from ground stations for communications to satellite communications during ascent. And I was in the pilot seat, of course, pretty busy. But when we did the rolled underneath, and I got my first view of the Earth. When you see Earth from up there, it does change perspective. I think it changes your perspective on how small the planet is. It changes almost everybody's perspective from an environmental standpoint.
Yeah, I remember one of the first times I looked out the window from space and I said to one of my crewmates, I said, what's that thin film over the surface? What is that? They go, oh, that's the atmosphere. Almost looks like a contact lens over somebody's eye, how thin and fragile it is compared to the size of the planet, which is kind of scary looking because it's the most important thing to our survival is our atmosphere. I think makes you more kind of in tune with environmental causes. I remember the rainforest in South America looked different on my first flight than it did on my last 17 years later. And then when you look at the planet, you don't see political borders. During the daytime, you do at night a little bit. Countries sometimes use different kind of light bulbs, so it's easy to tell. I'm on the International Space Station, but we're really all on a spaceship traveling through space called Planet Earth, and we're all part of the same team.
I know that you were on the International Space Station for basically a year. How did that come about?
Yeah, I was there for nearly a year. We launched in March of 2015, landed in March of 2016. It's one of the greatest successes of the International Space Station program is that you can have two countries that, historically can be at, not on the most friendly basis, unfortunately. You can work cooperatively on something that's probably the most challenging thing we do and demonstrate that we can work peacefully together as a team, and space is a perfect place to do that. And for us, our relationships as crew members, we have to rely on each other for, friendship, for help with our work, and literally at times for each other's lives.
Out of that competitive atmosphere that defined early space exploration came a whole new vision for collaboration. And then the International Space Station, and so many countries are involved.
The International Space Station, it's truly that, international. You have 258 astronauts that have been there from 20 different countries. And then when it comes to the countries involved in the ISS, I mean, this is going to test my geography more than anything, but we've got the US, we've got this big one.
Right, Russia here.
Russia.
Enormous.
We had Canada. Canada's up there.
We have Japan right here.
Japan, yep.
JAXA is very involved with space activities.
And then, you have the European Space Agency, which is going to make up a lot of the countries. Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK.
The International Space Station is just that. It's truly international. It's almost like in space, where borders don't exist.
The idea was that this would be a good way for NASA to get experience working on an International Space Station. That was the goal, to have our own space station. We had our first space station, Skylab, but this was going to be a little different. So this was an opportunity for astronauts to get some experience working on board a space station, kind of this building block for NASA. The international aspect of space station has been so vitally important. That's probably the most important legacy that space station will have. Many of the pieces of hardware, for instance, never met on the ground. The first time they met was up in space. And so just working together, I think it's so vitally important. We may not be able to do it on the ground, but in space we've been able to do it so successfully.
Hi, this is Steve Lindsay, commander of the Space Shuttle Discovery. Welcome.
You know, when you look at the space station and the international partnership and 16 nations up there working together all the time, that all gets blurred, and we're generally speaking one team up there. If you'd have told me when I was a pilot in the Cold War that within 10 years I'd be flying with Russians, I would have told you were crazy. But that changed.
Right now the plan is to deorbit the space station around 2030, right? And eventually you're gonna have to do that. I mean, things age, they age in space. You got on a spacewalk on the space station, it's surprising just how beat up it is outside. And the sun is just brutal. The changes of temperatures of, plus or minus 270 degrees. Thing gets hit on the outside. There's a lot of holes on the outside. Fortunately, so far those holes haven't penetrated the pressurized volume, but there is a lot of damage to this. So eventually you're going to have to put it in the Pacific Ocean.
One of the most important things that came from that experience was the twin studies, because you have an identical twin brother who's also an astronaut.
Yeah, because my brother and I were identical twins. We're genetically very, very similar, almost like, 99.9% genetically similar, that they felt like that they could get some good science data.
So the NASA twin study, the idea was born to try and get more genetic information and more molecular information and other types from people in space for longer periods of time. That's a little bit complicated to do, so what they thought was if we're going to use very small number of people, that they should be twins. That would allow us the ability to study one twin in space and the other twin on Earth. Doing that would allow us to better understand the differences that weren't related to genetics, right? Because they should have a fairly similar genetic profile.
For something to be statistically significant, you need a lot of samples.
Right.
And this is kind of a sample of one. Having said that, it's also a longitudinal study, so you can get statistically significant data by studying the same thing over a long period of time, meaning Mark and I.
So the goal was then to study them for 1 year, and Scott Kelly was the astronaut who was in space. And so both of the Kelly brothers gave enormous amount of time, willingness, blood samples, every kind of tissue we could get, psychological testing, physiologic testing, over that entire year period. And so at the time it was really the longest and most comprehensive scientific study that had been done to that point.
So that became part of the science program, and it got the most attention, more attention than the other science, which was actually probably more important, but just didn't have that kind of like cachet, human interest cachet that a story about two twin brothers doing a science experiment on the space station had.
Give us a few nuggets of the results of the twin studies.
Well, there are a lot of experiments, and I didn't give these experiments any more attention or less attention than I did everything else that we were doing. To the researchers, all of them, their science is the most important. And during the course of that year, we had 400 different experiments going on the year I was on the space station.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so this was, I don't know, it was probably 10 or 15 different studies. Some of them were on human cognition, like how does your brain change over the course of being in space from your ability to perform certain tasks and functions. What we would do is, I would collect data, or mostly it was like science samples, but there were tests that I would do, and then my brother would do the same ones on the ground. And I'll tell you what, you got to give him credit, because he didn't even work for NASA. I think they were going to pay him, but it was like so little that he said, don't bother. I don't want to deal with the tax headache from being paid, it's just really small amount.
So why is space exploration so important?
I think it's important for a number of reasons. We are, genetically speaking, I think explorers, right? If we didn't have that gene, we would still be living in a cave somewhere. We have this desire to see what's, over the horizon, what's over the ocean, what's in outer space, and what it gives to our society, to our economy, to our national security is worth every penny.
If you look at history, that's what human beings do. We've always explored, well before Christopher Columbus. you know, well before the Vikings. That's just something that human beings do, and I think that's just a continuation and an extension of what we've done in the past and will continue to do. And it's extremely important, it's extremely vital, beneficial to the American public, to the globe.
As space exploration transitioned to becoming more collaborative, it set the stage for how it can benefit life right here on Earth. But it's not just about going outwards, going to the moon. It's also about looking back at Earth. What can we learn about our own blue planet?
Looking back at the Earth from space gives us a whole new perspective on our planet.
Humans have always had the impulse to explore towards the night sky, towards the cosmos, towards the unknown.
Thrusting outward into space, we gain new perspective on ourselves.
But it's not just about going as far as we can. Space exploration also provides a unique vantage to look back at Earth, all of Earth, in near real time.
Exploring space, we learn quite a bit. We learn about our home planet, we learn about our solar system, we learn about our universe.
Sensors on satellites have revolutionized the way that we understand the Earth. The data is used for measuring snow cover, infrastructure in cities, mapping. There's a lot to explore.
The technology has increased in capability, has decreased in size and cost, and that enables a lot of things to happen.
I'm Krajnovic.
And I'm Myrna James. It's time to go behind the wings. A big focus for NASA and players throughout the industry has become our own planet Earth. So today we're going to focus on the question, what can we learn about Earth from data from space? To start, we'll talk with Dr. Kate Calvin to learn what NASA Earth is all about.
One of NASA's most important missions is our home planet, Earth. And we have a lot of research going on about Earth, from observations to models to technology. We measure the Earth on and above the Earth's surface so we can see the state of the Earth and how it's changing. We build computer models that help us understand Earth. They can both help us understand the processes that are impacting Earth. They also give us a window into the future so we can see how Earth might change going forward. So you think about some of the pictures that astronauts have taken from the Apollo missions or from the International Space Station, and you see Earth. You see this beautiful blue ball with clouds swirling around. And our satellites help us take those sorts of images nearly continuously and looking at all of the Earth. Each satellite is designed to measure something different. So some are looking at visible light, some measure changes in gravity. And we have more than 24 of these satellites and instruments in orbit. And together they let us see things like vegetation, carbon dioxide, clouds and precipitation, changes in the mass of ice sheets, and much more.
The satellite era in the grand scheme of Earth science is relatively recent. Started just after the launch of the Sputnik satellite in the late 50s. Into the early 60s, it was very experimental. There was a lot of funding for developing rockets and thinking about how to put people up there. In terms of the instruments that could view our Earth, that was a little bit secondary. Well, the first cameras that went up were analog. Film canisters were dropped from space down and being collected by people. Into the 70s, then digital technology started to come online, and that was really exciting because it allowed us to start to do some really fancy things like send out microwave signals with timestamps on them, which we use to power our global positioning system, or GPS network. Right, so we've come a long ways as Earth scientists in the use of satellite data. Right now, it's indispensable. It's difficult to imagine how science would be undertaken without satellite instrument measurements.
We've been collecting observations about the Earth from satellites for decades, so we can see not just the state of the Earth today, but how it's changed over time. One of the satellite programs that we have in partnership with USGS is called Landsat. And Landsat lets us see land use and land cover. So we can see where there are forests, where there are urban areas, where there are crops or snow. And we're coming up on our 50th anniversary of Landsat, so we have nearly 50 years of observations of land use and land cover. So we can see how that has changed over time. And when you look at Landsat records, what you'll see is expansions of urban area. You'll see declines in forest in parts of the world. And we have other satellite missions like that that give us different information. And we work with a lot of the commercial partners. So we actually have a commercial small sat data acquisition program where we buy data from some of the commercial small sats and make it available to NASA researchers so that we can do more climate research, more earth science research using other satellites, not just our own missions.
Satellites are constantly orbiting the Earth, and you probably use them every day, whether you realize it or not. We're about to use GPS, or the Global Positioning System, to head to Maxar's headquarters. We're going to meet with Dan Nord to learn more about satellites and their sensors. What can we learn about the Earth by looking back at it from space?
We think about that every day, and the answer is a lot. And so we have an ability to look at a holistic scale at the world and monitor change. And since we've been doing it for 25 years, we actually have change over time. And with that, you can model a lot of behavior. And then if you look globally, it's, where's the next big city growing up? We can answer that. The life cycle of a satellite is fascinating. At first, you need to figure out what you want to do with your satellite. And so we make high resolution Earth imaging satellites. We also make satellites that help with communication, whether it's Wi-Fi or other, and then multispectrals. And then you have to build a satellite, and this is the hardest thing. This is more like building a Ferrari. This is custom built, hand built, large scale technology that cannot fail. You can't go fix a satellite once it's up. There are some companies starting to think about how to do it, but the thing's moving thousands of miles an hour far away. So everything has to be checked, double checked, and quadruple checked.
So yeah, let's take a look at the satellite. It's got a couple different parts here. I mean, on the sides, I know you said satellites don't have wings, but what's happening on the sides?
Those are solar panels that brings in the sun's energy to power the vehicle. But this doesn't have wind resistance or anything. Solar panels can't fly.
They're not going to provide lift.
And then if you look up here, this is the camera. So this is actually inverted, aiming down at Earth.
So we have our power source, this would be our sensor, and then I imagine somewhere on here is a communication device to actually transmit that back to Earth.
There you go. Yeah, and so it's flying, taking pictures, and in real time sending the data down to our ground stations. And you've seen, what a generic ground station looks like. It's a dish looking straight back up. Space is hard, and what it's reflecting is just how complex building machinery that needs to withstand extreme temperatures on the hot side, extreme temperatures on the cold side, radiation. There's so much you have to protect against, and it has to work every time. You then, pick who's going to launch.
There we heard the final call. LD is go for launch.
And we have liftoff.
The last one we did for Sirius XM was on a SpaceX rocket. And then once it's up, they put it in the orbit that we ask for, either low or mid or high. And then we take about a month to get it into place and test every single element. And once that's done, we start pulling imagery down. These are big imaging satellites that can capture all of Denver in one pass, but then can zoom in and look at an individual vehicle with enough resolution to know what's the make and model, which is incredible. And then when it's time to decommission a satellite, you put it in a drag orbit and it burns up in the atmosphere.
Over 4 billion people are using Maxar technology every month. People are probably interacting with satellites whether they know it or not on a daily basis.
The way mapping works in the old days was you had to physically go to a place, and even Google, when they did their first mapping, they drove cars all around the world, whereas a satellite can do it relatively quickly.
I do want to focus in a bit because there are so many examples. Tell me about the work you do with the Jane Goodall Institute with chimpanzees and mapping and conservation.
From space, we can count animals. It's absolutely fascinating. We've done it with narwhals in Canada. With the amount of imagery we have over time, we can monitor their habitats. You always hear the stories, this population is dying. We can count that and check it and turn it into real ground truth, real fact. So we're looking for these use cases because this is new technology at a global scale. What can we use it for? We're getting really close, up close imagery where each pixel is about 30 centimeters. We understand what's happening on our planet. The observation and the crunching of these massive chunks of data. So we have 125 petabytes of imagery that we store and process, and we add to every day. I think it's 3.5 million square kilometers of imagery every day of the Earth, and we pull it in and we process it. We can run algorithms that say, hey, actually this corner of this place, it's going to be a drought in the next 5 years. That's information that's invaluable for either these companies or these nonprofits that want to help.
Here we have a map that shows SAIL, the Surface Atmosphere Integrated Field Lab, focused really in the Colorado Rocky Mountains. And it's a big watershed. It's got the Continental Divide, and that means a lot of people depend on it for water. It's a big area. They're using these satellites, but the satellites alone aren't enough to get verified data and to really see the big picture. That's something called ground truth.
Yeah, we definitely need ground control points so that you can verify on the ground, as you said, ground truthing the data from space to show that they're in the right place on the ground. That's really essential for any kind of scientific data like this.
We've made it to sunny Crested Butte, Colorado. We're about to head to the top of the mountain and check out one of SAIL's observation towers. They're using more than 50 sensors, taking measurements from bedrock to satellites in space. Let's go see how it works.
Water is life, and it's something that we rely on, and a lot of our ecosystems rely on as well. We're here in the headwaters of the Colorado River, the major river system of the western United States. It serves about 40 million people, and the water for that river comes from snow that we're seeing here in the mountains. We're getting a lot less of it. We're here to make some very detailed measurements of how that change is occurring. So we are midway up the mountain on Crested Butte Mountain Resort. We are at the mountain site of the Surface Atmosphere Integrated Field Laboratory, or SAIL campaign. So we can learn a whole lot about the Earth from space. I have had the privilege of working with a lot of satellite instrument data sets, and it's really remarkable because they're so powerful. One instrument smaller than this trailer is able to measure the entire planet. At the same time, the ways that we measure snow is from satellite. That's actually a real cutting-edge problem, something that NASA is definitely still working on. We're providing a great set of observations to help inform a number of the researchers on SAIL who are thinking about how to design what that satellite looks like. And the reason it's so hard is because just looking at where snow is doesn't tell you the whole story.
It's such a complex problem, and it's really about seeing the big picture from every different angle, from space to underground to 50 different sensors. And we're at one of the study sites. We've got a couple of them right here. Let's go take a closer look at the precipitation radar.
Inside that radome, that ping pong ball, is an antenna that spins around and sends out microwave energy at wavelengths about 3 centimeters. It's very sensitive to how much rain is falling or how much snow is falling. This instrument measures the input of water into watersheds that serve the Colorado River. My colleague Ken Williams will talk a lot more about water accounting and why that's such a big deal.
How are some of these instruments working in conjunction with satellite imagery or balloons going into the atmosphere and some of the other data points that you guys are collecting?
Absolutely. What we're going to be taking a look at is called the aerosol observing system, and what it's really trying to do is to measure the particulates in the atmosphere. You can see that deposition or that distribution of dust from things like balloon-based measurements, from fixed-wing aircraft, and from satellites as well. It's what we call variations in albedo. And so how white the snowpack is versus how dark the snowpack is really important in terms of how this melts out in the spring and how that meltwater finds its way to our local streams and rivers.
That is so cool. Dust is so small, but you can still see it from space.
That's absolutely true. It may be small, but it can have a really outsized impact on how snowpack and mountain snowpack behaves. And so this is the first place in the United States that allows us to link atmospheric processes, where, when, and how precipitation is falling and occurring, and how that precipitation finds its way into local streams, rivers, and into deep groundwater as well. The aerosol observing system. Let's go take a look at it.
Thank you. See, that's why you're the scientist. All right, let's look.
With the rise of climate change, increased stress on plants, we're actually really interested to understand how atmospheric processes play a role in delivering a critical element like nitrogen to these watersheds. Well, what that's really allows us to do is now to link satellite-based imagery from the Landsat satellite products to really look at the greenness of our forests, okay? And greenness is really a proxy for forest health. So we can go back over a decade of Landsat satellite data and look at how these forests are either increasing in their greenness or decreasing.
I've done field work measuring trees, and I spent a week measuring trees with a colleague, and we measured the width of every tree to give us a sense of how old it was and how much carbon it was storing. But we covered a very, very small amount of trees in our week there, where a satellite can cover the whole surface in that same amount of time, all of the Earth. And so they kind of work together though. We use the ground-based measurements to calibrate the satellites. We use the satellites to fill in the spaces and times that we didn't have ground-based measurements.
Wow, I can't even count how many sensors we've looked at already, but we've got miles to go before we sleep. And if the weather's good, we might even be able to launch a balloon this afternoon. Let's pop the skis back on and do it.
Let's get them on.
Here we go. Gothic, Colorado is a former mining town outside of Crested Butte that is now used for scientific research. And in the winter, it's only accessible by cross-country skiing. A few miles later, we arrived at the Gothic Research Center. So this is really cool. We're able to see from space pretty much where we're standing right now. I mean, you can almost see us right there.
Yeah, right?
Not quite, but...
Well, you know, if we put our hands out, maybe, you know?
The satellites are giving context to all the sensors and work being done on the ground. And just like there's sensors here on Earth, there's also sensors up on those satellites.
Absolutely. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing in these imagery where the extent of where the snow is, but that doesn't actually tell us how much water is in there. And so a lot of the measurements here are getting at those details of how much water is in the snow that we're seeing here in the imagery. We are looking at the imagery that was collected today of an instrument called MODIS, which stands for the Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectroradiometer, so kind of a mouthful. This is on the NASA Worldview website that shows all kinds of imagery. It's super powerful. We know it's from today because we can see this black spot here is where the satellite data hasn't actually collected information yet.
What's at stake with these measurements?
It's what's at stake is the development of a predictive capability for how much water we're going to have in the future. We would really like to know if there's going to be enough water for all of us this year, next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Without really going to these places and seeing what's actually happening on the ground, we're not able to know if any of our predictions have value.
We're getting ready to do the balloon launch. What exactly do you do to get ready and launch the balloon?
First, we prep a sonde, and this is one of your sondes here. We use this computer software here to condition this, and we basically calibrate it. So it has a relative humidity. We compare this sensor in here to a sensor inside here. Same thing with temperature.
And you make sure it's accurate.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the balloon is kind of just the vessel to bring it. How high exactly do these balloons go?
Say 90,000 feet. It sends via a radio link every second.
Okay.
So we get a download of height, temperature, relative humidity, and location, and it gives you some wind.
So we've got our helium balloon and a bunch of sensors. Yep. Going way, way up. Yep. All right, here we go. Launching. The weather balloon will rise into the mesosphere about 17 miles high, whereas the commonly agreed definition of space is around 62 miles high. Together, measurements from the weather balloon, the satellites, and all of the other sensors will help the sail team learn more about mountain watersheds. Water is life, and snow is life too for the 60 to 90% of people worldwide that depend on mountain watersheds for their water. We've made our way down to the Slate River, one of the tributaries to the Colorado. And even within the US, that's 40 million people that rely on this water. Now it turns out it's really hard to predict how much precipitation there's going to be in the mountains and how much of that's actually going to make its way into the river. And that's why SAIL is collecting an unprecedented amount of data from satellites orbiting right now all the way to underground to try to understand and actually predict the future. How much water will be here in 5 years? And that's a really important problem to solve.
This chart shows the increase in the number of operating satellites that exist right now. In 2006, there were less than 1,000. So fast forward to 2020, there were less than 3,500. And really, this number is going up exponentially with all the different satellites that are being launched, tiny little nanosatellites and small sats, especially the ones for global internet services that are coming up.
We're continually thinking about what we're going to launch next, what we want to measure next, which science questions we need to answer. But we're also working at the same time to design what's called the Earth System Observatory. And this is a set of satellites that are going to work together to provide a 3D holistic picture of the Earth from the surface up through the atmosphere. The first satellite in that will be a satellite called NISAR. And NISAR is going to let us measure changes in the Earth's surface at a fine level so that we'll be able to see things like ice sheet collapse and landslides. Satellites are really critical because they provide us continuous observations and they provide a large extent. So many of our satellites are global in scope, so we see the whole Earth, not just the area right in front of us. And that's really important because climate and Earth science, it's a global research area. And so the more we know about the entire Earth, the better we can understand Earth and the better we can think about how it might evolve in the future. And the satellites that we're designing and planning to launch in the future will provide even more information and give us a better sense of where we are and where we might go. So our data is, people use it around the world, from scientists to decision makers. And a lot of what we do when we're thinking about future missions is think about what questions do we have? What do we want to know about the Earth? And work from there to design a mission that can help answer that. So we know more than we ever have before. And every year we learn more. We keep developing new technologies and sensors that'll give us the ability to understand even more about the Earth, from heights of trees to how much snow, to sea level rise, changes in ice sheets, carbon dioxide. So we know so much about the Earth, and the more we learn about the Earth and the more we understand the processes that affect it, the better we can plan for the future.
Now we're looking at a map of satellites in orbit. There's over 19,000, and if you scroll around, you can kind of see, they kind of look like they're everywhere, right? And then you zoom in, lower Earth orbit, there's even more. So they're at different altitudes, they're at different orbits, they're all spinning at once.
This is the live map that shows where they really are, and you can see the concentration in low Earth orbit.
And what's interesting is if you flip the type to junk, it turns out over 13,000 of those 19,000 are not operational. They're junk, they're old, they're not being used anymore. The not junk is only 5,000, so there's way more junk satellites up there than operating satellites. And if you play that out, you know, over time, there's just going to be more junk, and you know, it raises these questions. How do you get rid of them safely? How do you avoid collisions? You know, when two objects collide in orbit, it creates thousands of small pieces, and all of those small pieces can then impact again, collide again with other objects in space. So the worst case scenario with space debris is that you kind of create a belt of space debris all around Earth, and that makes it pretty hard to leave orbit. So it kind of shows how serious this all can be. Thankfully, there are some companies today starting to work on that.
My name is Eric Ingram. I'm co-founder and CEO of Scout, and we're a company developing space domain awareness and vision capabilities for satellites to be able to navigate autonomously, so essentially by themselves. So the way we currently track things in space, be it satellites or debris, is primarily with Earth ground-based radars and telescopes that track the traffic going overhead in space to determine which dot is which satellite. As the number of satellites up there increases, that becomes more difficult. So what we want to do is be able to better track all of that to, again, make space a safer place to operate in. the cost of getting to space and the cost of all the technology is decreasing, and the capability of that technology is increasing. Just like your cell phone can do a lot more now today than it could 10 years ago. And the same thing is true with satellites. You see Earth observation, communication satellites, internet providing satellites all going up in the near future, and that's changing the way space is operated in. And so there's a lot more satellites up there that are using space to get all of these amazing services down to Earth. And companies like ours are working to make sure the space traffic is navigating in a safe way and that everybody's able to use space to provide these services to Earth.
Not all satellites have fuel on board to move, and so who has the right of way? What happened on the roads, and then the seas, and then the sky, we're going to see replicate in space. So as things get crowded, you have to pay attention to directing traffic. You need to pay attention to cleaning streets. So all of these are going to have analogs in space. It'll be a smaller scale at first, but everything is moving really fast. The commercial and government collaborations have created these companies like SpaceX, which are bringing business practices. I mean, now we can put things in space at volume to start really exploring the world and making second and third homes for humans. It's a really exciting time.
Space startups are filling in for services that weren't even possible a few years ago and are more necessary today than ever before.
More satellites and sensors in space provides us with more data than we've ever had before and more insights about the Earth. It also means that we need more infrastructure to support this increase in activity.